Hello and welcome to a Technical Problems special episode titled What Even Are Words? We Just Don't Know. While this is an obvious joke, it's also true. Defining a word is surprisingly difficult. Let's start with the hierarchy of the parts of speech. The smallest one is a phoneme. This might remind you of meme or gene. That is because it's meant to be the same thing. An indivisible minimal unit of, in this case, speech. Gene is an indivisible minimal unit of hereditary biological information, and a meme is an indivisible minimal unit of culture. And you build syllables from one or more phonemes. Syllable is a unit that has no pause within it. And from syllables, you build words which may have one or more syllables in them, and a single word carries a single unit of meaning. And from words, you build clauses which contain a single unit of message. So anytime you say something that makes sense, it's a clause. It might even just be one word. And a sentence is a self-contained message, which again might consist of one or more clauses. So you could have a sentence that contains one clause, which contains one word, which contains one syllable, and conceivably even one phoneme, although I can't think of one offhand. When it comes to phonemes, they are usually split into two, into vowels and consonants. Usually we start with a vowel and define consonants as the other kind. So what's a vowel? Most likely, if you went to school, you learned this by rote memorization, just as a list. Here are some sounds, and these are vowels. And if it is not on this list, it's a consonant. I did not go to school in English, but if you did, you probably learned them as A, E, I, O, U, and possibly Y, depending on context. But there are clear problems with this, particularly when you start getting into different languages that have a different inventory of vowels than your native language. Then there's the classical definition. Classical in the meaning of classical antiquity. This is the one that the ancient Greeks used. Here the vowel is the core of a syllable. So you might have a consonant at the beginning or end of a syllable, but you have at least one vowel. And that's what defines a vowel. This works for the classical Mediterranean languages, Greek, Latin, but not for all languages. You see, there are these things called syllabic consonants. You even have these in English, where certain consonants can take the place of a vowel as the core of a syllable. Such as in this example here, button, long itself is one syllable. You might pronounce button with the weak central vowel. Then it would be button. But this is a difference of dialect. Then there's another definition, the one that I came up with myself independently as a high schooler. That was that vowels would be sounds that you produce with a continuous airflow. But similarly to the classical definition, this has some problems in that it also contains some things that are consonants, such as L, S. You can keep this going as long as you have air in your lungs. I had actually accidentally defined a sonorant, which is a classifying group of phonemes that we will get back to later. And then an actual correct definition is a sound that you make with an open vocal tract with no pressure buildup in the mouth or throat. But this is a fairly technical definition. Maybe if we take start comparing sounds to the flow of water. There's flow of air in your mouth, So comparing it to water seems fairly obvious to me. Here we can start with vowels. These are things where the, let's say, the shape of the canal that the water is going through can be different. This is what differentiates different vowels from another. But the water can flow through freely. Then we have approximants, such as semivowels. These are, as the name implies, somewhat in the middle between a vowel and a consonant. They are basically vowels that occur at the syllable border, either at the beginning or the end. They are, you can think of them as moving from a vowel position towards a consonant, but not quite blocking the airflow, such as E or U, somewhere in between. And then you start getting into the actual consonants. These are sounds where your airflow is interfered with in some way. So here my first group are the liquids. These are like L and R. Think of this as like a stone in the canal. When you make an L, you put your tongue up so it interferes with the airflow, but the air can flow from both sides past your tongue. And the nasals are basically the same, but you are blocking airflow through the mouth. So it ends up, part of the air ends up coming out of the nose, or even all of it. When you make an N, there's air coming out of both, but you make an M, the mouth is completely blocked off, and all the air is coming out of the nose. So these groups are the sonorants. And basically what a sonorant means is that you can just keep going forever. And then there are, in opposition, things that are not sonorants are obstruents. So the airflow is actually being blocked. The closest to a vowel of these are the fricatives, such as F and S. You can also keep going with these indefinitely, but you notice how the entire airflow is restricted. Not like with liquids, where the airflow is split or otherwise interfered with in a slighter way. Then you have plosives like P and K. These are also called stop consonants because you actually stop the airflow. You can tense these for a longer time, and then you release them, and air begins to move again. Like, and another grouping are the affricates, which are the sort of sounds that you make when you tense a stop consonant and you use the release of air that happens when you release the consonant to produce another sound. It's also not different from aspirated consonants. So with the example of the, in this one you use the released air from the T to make an but you could also make in which case the released air is used to make different kind of fricative. So the consonants contain all of the obstruents and some of the sonorants, but not all of them. So, getting into syllables. A syllable is a unit of speech without a pause in it, but here we have an example that is perhaps a little confusing. It's French, and in this case, les amis. We have 3 syllables, les amis, but the last one is stressed. In this case, this is also an example of where the syllables can bleed into one another. The word the, le, historically had an S sibilant at the end of it, that however has partially disappeared. So when you just say le and something that begins with a consonant, there is no s in the middle. But when you use when you say the and a thing that has a vowel at the beginning of it, the z reappears, and this becomes les amis. But the z moves from the first syllable into the second one. So these syllable borders are permeable. They aren't fixed. They can change. A syllable consists by definition of at least 3 things, depending on your language. There's always a nucleus. This has to be one or more sonorants. My information, there are no languages where this is not the case. In many languages, the nucleus has to be a vowel, but there are some where the other sonorants are permissible. And then 0 or more consonants at the beginning and at the end. So you can have syllables without consonants at the beginning or the end, or that only consists of vowels. Usually, when discussing languages with tones, such as Mandarin or other Sinitic languages, the tone is considered another primary part of a syllable. I don't speak any of those languages, I'm not familiar with them, but to me, from a technical standpoint, it seems like the tone should be a component of the nucleus. After all, it's a quality of the vowels. So why it doesn't get counted as a subset of the nucleus, I don't know. You'd have to ask someone who actually knows Chinese. Actually, Chinese linguistics, not just the language. So, examples of syllables. Perhaps the largest syllable in the English language is strength. This one has 3 consonants at the onset, a single vowel as the nucleus, and again 3 consonants and in the coda. The coda, as in coda, Latin for tail, is just the final part of the consonant. This is a closed consonant, closed syllable, because it ends with consonants. There is a coda. Open and closed syllables are sometimes relevant for certain linguistic processes, but we'll get to those at some point when it becomes more relevant. Here we also see the difference between writing and pronunciation. The N and G are used to mark a single phoneme, and the T and H are used to mark a single consonant. So you have 3, 1, 3, but you have a lot more glyphs or letters in the word than you have actual phonemes. Then we have an example of where the nucleus has a consonant in it. This is the name of an island in Croatia, Krk. This is also a closed syllable. A syllable with no onset or coda, I, is only 2 vowels. Then ni has an onset and a nucleus but no coda, and at has no onset but has a nucleus and a coda. Stressing syllables is something that occurs, to my knowledge, in all languages, and it usually you have a 1 stressed syllable per word. This is not quite universal. Possibly the reason to have stressed syllables is exactly to make identifying words, so separating units of meaning from one another easier. This is a bit of conjecture, of course. There are different ways to stress syllables. In English, syllables are stressed in a variety of ways. In Russian, for example, the pitch has no bearing on the stress. This is why some people think that Russian sounds monotone, because the pitch does not change. Russian stressed syllables are longer than unstressed syllables. This is also the case for English. And they are pronounced more forcefully. So more air is expelled from the lungs while speaking a stressed syllable than an unstressed syllable. This is not necessarily the case. It is the case in English and Russian, but not for Italian or Japanese. In Italian, there's also the length of the syllable, but also the pitch. So, Mamma mia, for example, to overpronounce a little, you notice that the first syllables of both of these words are higher in pitch. They are pronounced for a longer time, but there is not really a difference in the amount of air used to pronounce them. And then Japanese basically only has a pitch accent. So when you have a stressed syllable in Japanese, it is pronounced somewhat higher than the other syllables. So which syllables in a word get stressed? That's also not entirely systematic. Some languages have a fixed stress pattern, such as Italian, where in Italian the stress syllable is almost always the penultimate, which means the second last. And traditionally for Germanic languages, the stressed syllable was always the first one. But loan words from other languages often retain the stress pattern of that language. Especially in English, that contains a huge amount of loan words from French, where the fixed stress is systematically at the last syllable. It can be very difficult to predict where the stress falls on an English word. And then you have languages where the stress pattern is variable, such as Russian, or from historical languages, Proto-Indo-European. I have seen some publications where the stress pattern of Russian was explained, but I did not understand it. It was a very low flow chart where the first topmost level had, I think, 7 nodes. So that's not really something you can intellectually understand. You just have to practice it. And of course, Russian children learn it as children and never think about it. For example, Russian words хорошо, stress syllable, the last one, and хороший, stress syllable, second syllable, quite different. Хорошо means well as an adverb, you did well, and хороший means good as an adjective. So, can you have a word that has no stressed syllables in it? There are some languages where this can never occur, such as Finnish. By definition, in Finnish, if there is one primary stress, that means that there is one word. And compound words have a secondary, weaker stress at their stressed syllables. For some languages, things like grammatical particles can be unstressed. As in English, you say to me. Me here is clearly longer. It is clearly higher pitched, and at least it should be more strongly aspirated. I am, of course, not a native English speaker, so whether or not I pronounce it correctly is always a matter of luck. Supposedly, Japanese should have completely unstressed words, according to some literature that I've read. But I've spent a very long time listening to Japanese, and I don't think I've ever noticed an unstressed word. So if this is actually true or not, I'm not quite sure. Maybe some of you do. In addition to stressed syllables within words, there is also a sentence level stress, which I am sure you have noticed while listening to me, that I stress some words more than other words. This is exactly what we are talking about here. Usually, there's a language-dependent pattern to this. For example, in Finnish, which has a very regular stress system, the first primary stress in a sentence is the strongest primary stress, and the following words are always more weakly stressed until the last word, which has the weakest stress and therefore should have the lowest pitch of the entire sentence. So, what is a word? Defining this has not actually been very possible. One idea would be that a word needs to have a valid meaning on its own. So if you can't say something on its own and make sense, it's not really a word. And here the question comes to grammatical particles in particular, like to me. Is to a word? You can imagine a context where you might say to or at on its own and it makes sense. So maybe it should be a word. Is it really a word? Who knows? When it comes to agglutinative languages, like Japanese here, watashi ni, is this, the ni is a form of conjugation, so it's comparable in function to the grammatical particle in English. But that's not a word, is it? Surely not. So does that mean that to is also not a word? That isn't really a valid answer to this. Another way of defining a word is, again, the single primary stress. This is how words are defined, for example, in the Finnish language. But there are languages where this turns into nonsense. These are called polysynthetic languages. Many Native American languages are like this. And if you've heard, let's say, a sensational description of a language where they have this word that means an entire sentence, that has been a polysynthetic language, because these are languages where, for example, the verb contains not only what is being done, but also who is doing it, and even to whom it is being done. So the entire factual content of a clause can go into one word if we define one word as a single primary stress. As such, this is not really a problem. Like, you can say that a single word can be a single clause, but it's counterintuitive. It doesn't feel like it should make sense that way. And we are left with not really having a good definition for a word. But this is mostly about phonemes, so let's get back to vowels and classifying and marking vowels. There are usually three components that are considered when describing a vowel. Two of these are where the tongue is in the mouth. If the tongue is high, it's called a closed, and if the tongue is low, it's called an open vowel. This is just convention. And then front and back are how far front or how far back the tongue is. The third one is the position of the lips. You have a rounded, where you are making, you're rounding your lips, like ooh. You know, if you make that while you're listening to this, you notice that you pucker your lips. They form this O form. Or is also a rounded vowel, so no wonder there. And unrounded is where your lips are wide, such as with ah. And another one that does not occur in all languages is nasalization. So nasal, non-nasal. The nasal here is the nose. So a nasal vowel is one that you, when you pronounce it, you let some air out of the nose as well as the mouth. And non-nasal ones are just, normal ones. I don't think English has any nasal vowels unless you are pronouncing a French word particularly close to the original pronunciation, which happens sometimes. And there are other kinds of ways to, other kinds of attributes to vowels that occur in more exotic languages. But if we ever get around to these, we'll talk about them at that point. So, for example, if we have a near open front unrounded nasal vowel, this means with the near open and front that the tongue is quite low but not quite at the bottom of the mouth, and it is forward. Unrounded means that the lips are wide apart, and nasal means that air goes into the nose as well as the mouth. So this is this is very common in French. So this is bain, which means bath. Then getting into consonants. The first way to classify consonants is how you get the air. So pulmonic consonants use the lungs. Most of consonants you are familiar with will be these. And then there are ejective and implosive consonants where you only move air through the throat. These are fairly rare. They do not occur in any of the languages I speak. I think they are mostly present in languages of sub-Saharan Africa and Native American languages. This would be sounds like if you have the hiccups, you are accidentally making an implosive consonant. And the fourth type of consonant is a click. You make this with your tongue and your mouth without actually breathing. These are usually used not within words, but to carry some kind of non-verbal meaning, such as you might click your tongue to communicate that you have understood, or that you are angry, or that you are disdainful. Currently, a dental click, like something like that. If you heard it, is a common way to vocalize distaste or disgust in Japanese. And if you watch an anime or read a manga where someone says, "Did you just click your tongue at me?" It's something like that that's being talked about. And once you have the airflow mechanism, you get to the place and manner of articulation. So here the place of articulation is where you make contact with the tongue and the rest of the mouth. So here the labial means related to the lips. So that's right at the front of the mouth. The dental is teeth. The alveolar ridge is the thing that's behind your teeth on the upper jaw. The palate is the flat part that's behind that. The velum is the back part of the roof of the mouth. The uvula is the hanging dangly bit at the back of your mouth, and the glottis is the throat. So, for example, for stops where you tense the air and then suddenly release it, labial stop is one you make with your lips. So it's P, An alveolar one is one you make with the alveolar ridge. So this is time. A velar stop is one you make with the back part of the roof of the mouth, such as call. And glottal stop with this question mark looking symbol is one that you make with the throat. This is not really used as a part of words in English, but it does exist in English, such as in uh-oh. And if you consider a Cockney English, this might take the place of some of the other stop consonants at the end of a syllable or a word, such as button might turn into button. So, fricatives. Here are consonants where you interfere with the airflow. F is a labiodental fricative, and you make it by pressing your upper teeth against your lower lip. So, it's both. You use both the lips and the teeth. So the next one here, th, is somewhat different because now you really use the tongue. You use the tongue against teeth to produce th. So this is a dental fricative. Moving back in the mouth, you have three sounds that are usually allophones. So we'll get back to that. That means that people who speak these languages might not realize that these are different sounds. For example, in German, the in Chemie and in Buch are actually pronounced fairly far apart from one another. But people who speak German and have never thought about this and have never learned about this might not realize that they're not the same. Here you might notice that the in Buch is pronounced at the same area as the k in book. Buch. This is exactly why. The original pronunciation of Buch was book, and this fricatization has occurred in High German, but for example not in Low German or the Scandinavian Germanic languages or English. And then you have glottal fricative hall. You sometimes see people calling the Arabic fricatives guttural, which also tries to say that they are pronounced very back in the throat. But actually the English H is also pronounced very back in the throat, so it's a bit of a weird thing to say. Then, to take a third example series, we have trills. These are uncommon in English, but usually most languages have at least one. A labial trill is one you make with your lips. So this is a horse noise, obviously. But there are languages that use this as like a normal consonant. That they make words where you have a horse noise and then a vowel and maybe another consonant. And once we get inside the mouth, so really using the tongue, these are things that we might conceptualize as R's. The alveolar trill, so using the tongue and vibrating it against the alveolar ridge, is like in Italian. This was also traditionally the R of English, but it has developed away from it. There's also the French R was an surprisingly long. At the end of the 17th century, there was still actually textual evidence that French was pronounced with this one. But since then, in the last 300 years, the French R has moved to the back of the mouth, to the uvula, and become Then, more about consonants. There are both voiced and non-voiced consonants. Most languages have both, some don't. For example, the Uralic languages traditionally had no voiced consonants. Uralic languages are the ones that contain, for example, Finnish. You can tell if consonant is voiced or non-voiced by putting your fingers at your voice box and making the sound. If you make an s, there's no movement, but when you make a l, there is. Most vowels are voiced, but some languages have non-voiced vowels. Supposedly including Japanese, but again, I've been listening to Japanese for a long time and I've never noticed this. So it's either very subtle or possibly only in some dialects. Who knows? Sibilants such as S and Z can also be hushed. The IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet, symbol for this is different from the normal sibilant. So this is a sh, like in school. No, you don't actually have that in English. It's Schule in German. Well, hush has a sh at the end of it, and the number 3 looking symbol is a voiced hushed sibilant. So maybe you've heard someone pronounce garage with this, maybe not. And these are made when the tongue is curled back. When you make an S, if you compare that with your hand, it's like making a claw. But when you make a hushed sibilant, it's like turning the fingers up. And actually, my fingers can't do this, so when I make this movement, I have to turn my my wrist. Then there's a series of concepts such as palatalized, labialized, pilarized. You might notice that these are parts of the mouth. So the palate, the lips, the velum. And what these mean is that there is a certain secondary articulation on the release. We already started on this concept. So you have, for example, palatalized. Consonants are ones that the IPA symbol is a small j as a superscript. This is because the IPA symbol for y is a j. This is the original meaning of the symbol. And also the current symbol in many Central and Northern European languages. So for Russian, the word for no is niet, where the n is palatalized. But this is different from niet, which is the way you might hear someone who does not speak Russian trying to imitate the Russian accent. When you palatalize something, you use the air from releasing the consonant to produce the secondary articulation. So it's one consonant. It's like ts or church. You have two components, but there's no separate airflow for the two of them. Then there's labialization, for example, with Latin. Sequi, to follow, as the superscript W here, and that's W as secondary articulation. Then there's also aspiration, which is very similar, but you just use extra airflow. For example, this exists also in English. You have a pin or pen, and in this case you have a strong airflow at the release of the consonant, but there are also allophones of P inside of words where this does not occur. In German you have Tal, again. This is actually something, if you see the word Neanderthal, for example, written with a TH, this is because aspirated consonants in German used to be written with an H at the end of it. So there has been a spelling reform. Tal is no longer written Tal, but it is still pronounced Tal. And finally, to allophones. I've alluded to these several times, but let's go through them honestly here. So an allophone is when certain consonants alternate in different contexts. So there is no difference of meaning between these. You can't, for example, you don't have words that are pin and pin in English. There are languages in the Caucasus Mountains where this is the case. And in for English, stop consonants aspirate only when they are stressed and word initial. So here in pin, this is aspirated, but spin is not aspirated. And conversely, you don't have a word pin, pin, and you do not have a word spin. I should have made some better notes. I can't remember what I was thinking about with the voices and stops here. Oh yes, yes. Have to read the second and third lines as well. Good that I wrote them. Otherwise, I would have completely forgotten what I was thinking about. So when you have a plural with an S at the end, it's usually a voiced S, so a Z. Voices, or several voices. But when you have a stop consonant at the end of the word, the plural S is non-voiced, so stops, not stops. This is because it's difficult to pronounce. It's more difficult to switch from voiced to non-voiced or vice versa than it is to stay within voiced or non-voiced. So here the vowel in voices is voiced, and then you have a voiced sibilant after it, so it's easy to pronounce. And it stops, the P is non-voiced, and then you stay non-voiced for the S. When it comes to allophones, there's a concept called an archiphoneme, which is sort of the master phoneme, which the people speaking this language probably conceptualize these as variants of. So, for example, in Japanese, there's an archiphoneme N, but it might be pronounced 3 different ways depending on the context. You have the basic N, such as sun, number 3, but this is turns into an M when there's stop. Then there's a P in front of it, P after it. So senpai, not senpai, is again really a process of assimilation. It's is simply articulated more similarly to P than N is. So in order to make it easier to pronounce, it moves into a slightly different position. And then it can also be ng, like in Sengoku. You could you'd have to ask a native Japanese speaker who is not really up to date on language if they have noticed that these are different. For example, my native language has several affricate allophones that I had not realized before I read about it. And when I read about it, I immediately spoke these words aloud and noticed that, yes, exactly, they are, the places of articulation are actually quite different. But even I had not noticed this before actually thinking about it. So it's easy to miss something like this. And this has been the end of this presentation. La missa è finita. Thank you for attending my TED Talk, and hopefully next week we'll have this live on the air.